August 1945 was unlike any moment the world had ever lived through. In the space of days, humanity had crossed into a new age, one where cities could disappear in a flash and where a single decision made in a single room could alter the course of civilization. President Harry Truman sat at the center of that storm, and while history remembers only 2 atomic strikes, the uncomfortable truth is that the United States was already preparing for a third. Plans existed, components existed, target lists existed, and behind closed doors, debates were unfolding about where the next bomb would fall, how the world would react, and what would happen if Japan refused to surrender at all. The pressure was immense. Japan had not yet officially accepted the Allied terms. Intercepts were confusing, mixed, contradictory. Truman's military advisors prepared for the possibility that Japan might hold out for days, weeks, or even months. And in those meetings, they made it clear. A third strike was not only possible, it could become necessary. This forced Truman into a series of discussions that most Americans never knew happened. One of the earliest topics was the target list. The obvious question everyone in the room had to confront was, where would the next bomb fall? Generals brought forward a revised list of candidate cities. These were not random selections. They had been studied for months. Each city offered different military, industrial, and symbolic impacts. 4 names dominated those lists: Kokura, Niigata, Kyoto, and Sapporo. But Kyoto had been removed earlier in the war for cultural reasons, and Sapporo presented logistical problems. That left 2 real contenders. Kokura, with its huge arsenal, industrial network, factories, and tight urban construction, was the first choice. In fact, it had already been the target for the second strike. But cloud cover and smoke had forced a diversion. Because of that weather miss, the city remained intact. To the US military, this made Kokura the leading candidate. It represented unfinished business, strategically and psychologically. Niigata was the secondary target. It was a coastal industrial center with major port facilities, oil storage tanks, and rail lines the Japanese needed desperately. But the distance made it a backup, not the preferred choice. What shocked Truman most wasn't just the cities on the list. It was the realization that military planners had multiple options prepared, each with detailed maps, flight paths, and expected blast effects. The machinery of planning for a third strike had been in motion even before Japan understood what the first 2 bombs meant. But the discussion didn't stop at where. The next topic was much darker. The military needed to know something unsettling. If Japan refused to surrender after a third strike, how many bombs would America be prepared to use? And even worse, how many could America actually produce? It was one of the few moments where silence fell over the room. Scientists from Los Alamos explained that the Manhattan Project was still producing material. More plutonium cores were coming. The assembly lines were improving. If necessary, the US could likely produce 1 atomic bomb every 8 to 10 days, starting in late August or early September. That number shocked everyone, including Truman. Not because it showed American power, but because it forced him to consider the possibility of a war that escalated without limit. If Japan continued fighting, the military argued, the United States might need to use several more bombs. They didn't know how many. There was no number that guaranteed surrender. And because Japan was showing signs of political division, not unified leadership, predicting their decision-making was nearly impossible. The unspoken fear was simple. If there was no surrender after the third strike, would America drop a 4th, a 5th? At what point would it become too horrific to continue? At what point would the world turn against the United States not as a liberator, but as a nation unleashing something beyond all moral boundaries? Truman pushed back hard. He asked questions no one else dared ask. What would the world think if America struck again? How would future generations see a nation that used this new power repeatedly? If the war dragged on, would the world believe the US? was acting out of necessity or out of something far more dangerous. Some of his advisors argued that the world would understand. They believed the destruction would force surrender and save countless American lives. Others warned that international trust might crumble. America was stepping into a new era where every action would set precedent. If multiple atomic strikes became routine, then the age of normal warfare might be over forever. Truman understood this instantly. If the US used atomic bombs again and again, war itself would transform into something unmanageable, something that could spiral into a world where nations responded to crisis with annihilation, not diplomacy. He had inherited the Manhattan Project unexpectedly, and he had approved its first use because he was convinced it would end the war. But now he faced a nightmare scenario, a war that did not end, even after 2 strikes. A war where Japan's internal divisions, not its military strength, prevented surrender. A war where the United States had to decide how far it would actually go. The scientists offered Truman both clarity and fear. They estimated that enough plutonium for more bombs was already on the way. Assembly teams were still working. There was no technical barrier to creating more. In fact, the process was becoming more efficient. The military could potentially drop a 3rd bomb in the second half of August, a 4th in early September, and more after that. The idea horrified Truman. The war could become endless, not in months or years, but in scale. Each bomb would push humanity further into unknown territory. Behind closed doors, Truman asked his advisors something few leaders in history have ever asked. At what point does the cost exceed the victory? How many cities could be erased before the world began to fear America more than it feared Japan? How many times could the atomic threshold be crossed before it broke something deeper in human civilization? Generals answered him in military terms, scientists answered him in technical terms, but Truman was asking a moral question, the kind that has no charts, no graphs, no predictable outcomes. Even as these discussions took place, intelligence from Japan grew more chaotic. Factions inside the Japanese government were fighting over whether to accept peace. Some wanted immediate surrender, some wanted to negotiate, others wanted to fight until there was nothing left to fight with. Truman realized that if Japan fractured further, if one faction refused to surrender while another begged for it, the war might not end cleanly, and if he authorized the 3rd bomb too quickly, it could land in the middle of that chaos, turning an already unstable situation into a political earthquake. He worried about global reaction as well. News of a 3rd atomic strike would spread instantly. Allied nations were already shocked by the power of the first 2. Some leaders wondered how far America intended to go. Some were quietly alarmed by a future in which one nation possessed this level of destructive force. Truman feared that repeated atomic strikes could destabilize not only Japan, but the post-war world. He feared that America would set a precedent, that nuclear warfare was not extraordinary but acceptable, and once that line was crossed repeatedly, no one could ever walk it back. So Truman made a decision that few people know about today. He called for direct control over every atomic action. No 3rd strike would happen automatically. No timetable would advance without his approval. He seized authority not to use the power, but to restrain it. Behind the scenes, that single order slowed everything. Technical crews paused, delivery units waited, scientists recalculated, the momentum halted, and then, just as tensions reached their absolute peak, Japan finally sent confirmation they would accept the Allied terms. The message was nearly intercepted by officers trying to stop surrender. For a moment, it looked like even this last chance could collapse, but the message got through. Truman ordered all preparations for the 3rd strike to stop immediately. The bomb existed, the target existed, the plan existed, but he refused to cross that line again unless there was absolutely no other choice. He believed that history would remember the restraint as much as the power. Japan surrendered, the third bomb was never used, and the world stepped back from a future where destruction might have become continuous. And that's the truth most people never hear. The most important decision Truman made in August 1945 wasn't dropping the first bomb or the second, it was stopping the third. If you found this moment worth exploring, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this and comment which historical moment you want next.